Well, first of all, deep thanks to the organizers for bringing us together and embarking us on this very challenging and provocatively hybrid subject. I think the lesson that I want to read out of literature is the way in which hope is engendered by human helplessness. And I realize that's probably not what anyone wants to hear. You could certainly not get yourself elected to public office on that kind of a platform. But let's think about it. The COVID-19 pandemic has spread far beyond the parameters of medical science and public health. It's pushed our societies and their systems of symbolization to new limits and new thresholds. The full consequences are, of course, going to be seen over the course of future years. But we're dealing here with a generalized crisis that has become a human tragedy. And of course, it strikes differently at different levels of society and across different regions around the world. It's made the burning questions of equity, equality, and justice even more acute. But one terrifying and potentially salutary and unexpected effect in the midst of the mayhem has been to reveal us to ourselves. This is where hope has to begin, in an augmented self-awareness. And we're forced to face hard truths that otherwise it's all too tempting to look away from and persist in denying. This is what I hold to be the cathartic purpose, a kind of purge, that pandemics since antiquity have constantly served. The revelation forced on us by pandemics is apocalyptic, furthermore, I want to maintain, in that its disclosure reaches all the way to the end of the world, to death, which alone enables us to see and thence to receive and appropriate our life whole. Now, the realization, and I want to say even the revelation, provoked by pandemics is essentially mediated by imagination, which means also then emotion, and hence the importance of literature to processing the pandemic. This human verbal mediation is at work in news reporting and chronicling, as well as in commentary, investigative journalism, but all the more penetratingly in the more deeply reflective and deliberately imaginative expressions that are found in literature. Plague descriptions abound in literature, from the Bible, the 10 plagues in Exodus, classical antiquity, both Greek, with Homer, Sophocles, Thucydides, and Latin, Lucretius, Virgil, Ovid, through the Middle Ages, preeminently Boccaccio, but many others, and the early modern period, Daniel Defoe, passing on to Italian Romanticism, Alessandro Manzoni, and French Surrealism, Antonin Artaud, and existentialism, Albert Camus. Narratives by all of these authors reflect on the sobering experience of being forced by plague-provoked catastrophes to face certain crushing, complacency-shattering truths about life and death that we otherwise inevitably contrive to elude and fool ourselves about. In subtly variegated ways, each pandemic episode, as commemorated in literature, holds up a mirror to our present and perennial predicament and its quandaries. Lawrence Wright's novel, The End of October, that's 2020, it was researched and written before the COVID outbreak, but it prophetically anticipates many of its most horrific and hallucinatory features. And with this work of contemporary fiction, then, I want to bring this historical survey of selected samples from world literature up to date, near our own time, on the eve of this most recent outbreak of pandemic. And it's a best-selling thriller, so it also opens our topic then to the archives of popular culture, which since the Middle Ages has left riveting testimonies about the traumatic experience of pandemics, often in an apocalyptic perspective. And we can see some of these on the Newberry's website under Learning from Pre-Modern Plagues. historical and or fictionalized accounts of literal plagues, imagining literal death and disease, however, are not the whole story or the only approach. There are also moral and spiritual contagions, plagues in a metaphorical and allegorical sense, infecting the whole human race. And a prime example here would be original sin as a hereditary congenital disease that infects all humankind, transmitted through concupiscence at conception. Of course, St. Augustine reading Paul as by one man sin entered into the world and death through sin from Romans. And these moral metaphorical plagues are every bit as consequential as the literal ones in working apocalyptically in our cultural imaginary. But in any of these cases, plague alludes to something that surpasses humanly ascertainable reality. The idea of plague as retribution from heaven lurks always near and looms large over these accounts, even when such an idea is openly contested and subjected to ridicule. Camus captures the derisive spirit in which superstitious notions about the plague's causes and origins are mocked, even by those being devastated by forces beyond their control. Indeed, the mocking humanists who refuse supernatural explanations are derided in their turn by the facts. Our fellow citizens, in this regard, were like everyone else. They were thinking of themselves, or in other words, they were humanists. They did not believe in divine scourges. The scourge is not within the reach of man. Therefore, one says it is unreal, a bad dream that will pass. But it does not always pass. And from bad dream to bad dream, it is humans who pass. And humanists in the first place because they did not take precautions. Our fellow citizens were not more guilty than others. They forgot to be modest, that's all. And they thought that all could still be possible for them, which presupposed that scourges are impossible, right? Because we had no power over them. The plague as a scourge from heaven then is deemed impossible because we have no hope of dealing with it by any human means. If we can combat and overcome it, if we cannot combat and overcome it, then it cannot exist. This is typical humanist reasoning as Camus construes it. Is there then a different kind of hope in what is not within our own means and methods? A hope that breaks us open beyond ourselves into relation with something other and absolute, something perhaps divine, or real beyond our control and comprehension. Is this other sort of relatedness beyond our own human self-relatedness the lesson that humanity has had to learn over and over from the agonizing experience of pandemics, most recently the COVID-19 crisis? That's really my question, and I think you hear my thesis in that as well. What is impossible for Camus' humanists with their faith in human progress becomes paramount from a postmodern point of view, peering beyond the human to the post-human and beyond the modern project of unlimited progress. Jacques Derrida, another declared atheist in the French philosophical tradition a generation after Camus, would come to focus precisely on the impossible as what most needs to be thought. What is impossible within our humanly constructed order and system of thought challenges us to exceed ourselves and confront something radically and irreducibly other. Derrida himself understood this challenge as a kind of summons or calling with apocalyptic overtones and undertones. This postmodern turn brought about by Derrida and company comes in the wake of Martin Heidegger's critique and surpassing of humanism and its ethos of technological domination of the planet. His letter on humanism is the main text. It's all over Heidegger, of course, but he really focuses on that. Brief über den Humanismus. Plague devastates humans beyond their capacity to control or escape it. This is why it has always been interpreted, at least by some of those seized in its grip, as a judgment from God. Without presupposing any determinate theology, I want to emphasize that pandemics force us to confront an absolute reality, or the absoluteness of the real, that transcends human manipulation and management. plague reminds us of our impotence, and it wakes us up to recognition of what utterly surpasses our capacity to resist. Particularly death must be recognized as an unnegotiable limit that leaves humans powerless, hard as that is for us to accept. But also, no matter how healthily we strive to live, we're all subject to sudden destructive disease striking us down unexpectedly. This, I submit, is the most universal, far-reaching significance of plague or pandemic that can be inferred from the works of many of our most clairvoyant authors across the ages. Theology, or more exactly, negative theology, entails essentially recognition of a reality beyond our own ordering and management. Reality is other to the systems that we make. This other is the source of the hope I consider to be genuinely hopeful against our delusion of mastering everything through our technologies. Our vaccinations, quarantines, border controls, carrier tests, contact tracings, curfews, confinements, protective masks, and the rest, which can be alibis and ersatz offerings that engender a falsely comforting kind of illusory hope. From ancient and medieval authors like Homer and Boccaccio to Defoe and modern novelists, plague has been consistently interpreted as a scourge for human waywardness and sin. The terrible specter of the Black Death rearing its ugly visage is treated in all different imaginable manners as a terrifying punishment ordained from above, from heaven. The confrontation with superior power that annihilates humans finally in death is brought on the scene as a constant threat that comes to consciousness whenever and wherever pestilence strikes. This is how pandemics open a theological dimension, reaching to the infinite beyond human grasp. We face our own annihilation by what is an absolute power lording it over and crushing us. This confrontation with annihilation constitutes the ground for opening to a dimension of ultimacy, such as invites theological and specifically apocalyptic interpretation, or at least negative theological speculation. Whether or not we can put any positive description of divinity on it, we find ourselves faced with an unconditional absolute to which we are subjected even abjectly, as it annihilates our very being in the world. Now, of course, enlightened responses resolutely refuse the theologizing that makes humans perversely helpless and that is all too often used as a pretext for neglecting necessary prophylactic measures. However, considering enlightenment dialectically, I think there's also something sound about theological responses in the sense especially of negative theology in recognizing the limits of our human faculties and our being beholden to and dependent on powers beyond our control. Gaia, the earth, for one. Thanatos, death, for another. Hope for me is not to be placed in new vaccines or more sophisticated technologies to render us invulnerable to pandemics, but more fundamentally in learning to accept and assume actively and resiliently our constitutive human vulnerability. I should make clear that this is not an oppositional logic. That's not really an argument against these prophylactic measures. But putting them within a horizon, that's not enough. It's maybe not even what's most essential in responding to plague and pandemic. Fiction can be particularly revealing as a mode of indirect affirmative expression correlated with negative theology of the unconditioned or the eruption of the unspeakably other. To call any discourse a negative theology simply means that its object or intent, like God, is imagined as infinitely surpassing its powers of expression. Kafka's fictions are among the most transparent and programmatic instances of such negative theological imaginings of our being delivered over to irresistible, opaque powers, the castle, the trial, that dominate us all the more implacably the more we struggle against them. The histories of the plague in London in 1665 and in Milan in 1630 are the basis for the fictions of Defoe and Manzoni, respectively, both of which straddle historical reporting and the fictionalizing of historical events. myth and fiction work in tandem with history to become channels for raising consciousness at an existential and theological level of something in itself unrepresentable, but pervasively powerful over us. And Boccaccio, too, by setting his sometimes frivolous fictions into counterpoint with the harrowing history of the plague, triangulates history and fiction on the unrepresentable other as source of trouble or destruction, but also of hope. The gnawing question that always comes up in the face of plague is why? And the hypothesis or disturbing presentiment that plague is caused by higher powers always presses forward in spite of all rational resistance. Showing up humanity as abjectly dependent on and helplessly beholden to some mysterious power beyond itself is always an upsetting revelation, one unacceptable to most any consistent rationalism. History and fiction work together in opening within existential reality a space for encounter with something absolute and not accessible within the order either of fact or of mere fantasy. Plague raises the specter of the metaphysical or theological dimension of being or nothingness, to be or not to be, whether it's interpreted naturalistically or supernaturally. Homer unquestionably attributes the plague among the soldiers in the 9th year of the war before Troy. He unquestionably attributes the plague to Apollo's arrows. The god is motivated to punish the offense of his divine dignity by Agamemnon, who refuses to honor the suit of Apollo's priest Crises, bringing lavish gifts for the ransom of his daughter Chryseide. Thucydides, in contrast, does not venture to speculate about causes of the plague in Athens at the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War. He leaves that expressly to others. Nonetheless, he sees pestilence as pushing humanity to its limits and forcing it to interrogate its why and wherefore. For Sophocles, the plague is visited on Thebes because of Oedipus's transgressions, as revealed by Tiresias the prophet. And Seneca plays up the supernatural and apocalyptic overtones already clearly marked in Sophocles. Lucretius is arguing for a purely natural point of view, explaining the plague through his atomic theory. It's a maleficent combination of atoms or germs, semina, that causes a contagious miasma that circulates in the air. He arrives nevertheless at piercing reflections of a metaphysical order and tragic tenor. And the fact that this devastating description of plague comes at the very end of his epic places his whole optimistic Epicurean philosophy in a complex and dubious light. It seems implicitly to call into question the efficacy of the Epicurean ethics of disciplined self-control for maximizing pleasure and well-being that have been developed throughout the work, right? It ends with this horrific scene and nothing further. The discourse of the poem is really overwhelmed and reduced to silence by the plague. It was supposed to be an optimistic Epicurean philosophy. We're not sure really where Lucretius leaves us at the very end of Book 6, the final book of his epic, De Rerum Natura. The polarity of diverging attributions, naturalistic versus supernatural, purely human versus mythical and theological, opens up between Lucretius and his imitators then, Virgil and Ovid, who insert their descriptions into elaborate mythological contexts, evoking the agency of the gods. In the Middle Ages, for Boccaccio, God's governance of the universe is without appeal and beyond question, and so it's l'ira di Dio, the just anger of God, justa l'ira di Dio, is evoked as the plague's cause from the very first day of the Decameron. The tension then is accentuated in modern secular culture and becomes more conscious and explicit, emphasizing an agonizing choice of points of view, regardless of whether it elicits a metaphysical or a medical regard. The plague is apt to occasion more searching self-examination and exposure to the contradictions and paradoxes of human nature. Plague strips away the veneer of what civilization conceals. The Decameron's darkly solemn, grave, and pathetic account of the plague emphasizes, above all, how it forces us to face up to some unseemly truths about our humanity, that society in its normal functioning is well organized to mask and dissemble. All sense of the dignity of persons is lost or completely violated as cadavers are heaped up together in piles, and basic bonds of kinship and community cease to function in the face of the terror of the Black Death. Corpses are dumped into ditches without customary funeral rites. When normal social order breaks down, a savageness in us is unmasked. Certain truths about life and death are revealed, but also about the social and imaginative constructions that are ingeniously or deviously designed to hide and disguise these appalling dispositions and propensities of an only superficially civilized humanity. Defoe's narrator is convinced, like Boccaccio, that the plague is a punishment from God. But many of his interlocutors do not share this conviction. The narrator admits that even my brother, though a very religious man himself, laughed at all I suggested about its being an intimation from heaven, and told me several stories of such foolhardy people as I was. And he quotes the psalm. He resolves not to flee from London, to stay in the city, trusting in God, and quoting from Psalm 103, surely he shall deliver thee from the snare of the fowler and from the noisome pestilence, neither shall any plague come nigh thy dwelling. Manzoni's treatment swings ambiguously between consistent rationalism and a more mythic apocalyptic vision of the historical significance of the plague. Ironically, driven by fear, rationalism itself can become irrational and fanatical. The preference of the larger public, as represented in the novel, is for attributing the plague to tangible causes that can be combated, specifically the smearers, untori, or poisoners. For anger aims to punish and prefers to attribute the evils to human perversity, against which it is possible to take refuge. Impossible to take refuge from a cause to which one can do nothing other than resign oneself. It's like Camus' humanists, right? But on the other hand, religious causes, when made concrete, also stand under accusation. Manzoni displays at great length the public penance drawn out in a religious procession of the relics of St. Carlo Borromeo, the beloved combatant and victim of a previous bout of plague in Milan. This public spectacle was demanded by popular sentiment as a measure to placate divine anger and hopefully allay the plague. It was allowed only against the better judgment of the ecclesiastic in office, who was Federico Borromeo, the great saint's heir and spiritual successor. The surge of demonstrative public piety is shown to be another sort of irrational emotional behavior, one also concretizing the evil in something tangible, even if this time it's a symbolic rite. This type of reification is all too endemic to human minds, and especially to the feelings of popular masses. The result, predictably, is exponential aggravation and spreading of the contagion. Manzoni is himself a piece of an Enlightenment thinker at times, although at other times he's an incorrigible romantic. He was educated in the 18th century Enlightenment ideals, but he was soon swept up in the romantic currents of his time. He blames the public authorities for not minding the medical experts who issued warnings about the plague. He deals derisively with the slow and painful process of gradually, reluctantly coming to recognition and avowal that indeed it was plague and not something else less frightening. not truly plague. That is to say, plague, yes, but in a certain manner of speaking, not plague proper, but something for which we're not able to find another name, right? These are some of the mocking expressions that he attributes to the avoidance, which is natural. Nobody wants to face this horrible fact. We saw that over and over with the COVID outbreak as well. The idea that human expertise and action can master such menaces reflects Manzoni's faith in reason and a conviction that we must manage such problems. Yet, what's really interesting about this novel, those who do manage to positively confront the pandemic are exemplarily fra Cristoforo, right, brother Christopher. They are religious saintly figures like Borromeo. They're resigned to die in self-sacrifice for the salvation of others. They conquer themselves and thereby convert the hearts of others, even while succumbing physically to the irresistible virulence of the pandemic. The vision of history underlying the novel is ultimately a Christian providential vision, fideistic. It's based on an indeterminate faith, fiducia indeterminata, says it's in the narration itself, rather than on any demonstrable certitudes. So, for all his meticulous tracing of causes, Manzoni also recognizes the ostensibly arbitrary nature of the contagion that comes and goes like the rain, is what comes on at the end, chapter 37, in spite of all that humans can do. This acknowledgement of the incalculable and inscrutable which the pandemic makes us face, together with the uselessness of all human measures against it, comes back and comes forward in all of our selected authors. Thucydides, Lucretius, and Ovid all emphasize the utter cluelessness of medical science to comprehend and combat the plague. Thucydides, neither could the physicians do anything. I'm just going to go very quickly. Lucretius admits that medicine stood paralyzed in silent fear. Ovid, the scourge exceeded our ability to resist, which lay vanquished. For Virgil, all human arts only made things worse. And the cessere magistri, the physician simply ceased. Boccaccio, too, repeats this trope of the utter incapacity and unpreparedness of physicians in their medical arts. The ancient theme of human helplessness, as revealed by plague, is common to all of our accounts, whether their authors are religiously inclined or strictly secular. The surpassing of human capacity opens a dimension of the beyond that can be inhabited by hope or despair. The same mystery as surrounds the cause and origins in the ancient medieval texts continues to envelop, especially the accounts in modern texts, of the relenting and cessation of pandemics. Remission of the pestilence lies beyond human control and is experienced as a kind of miracle or grace, like the rain at the end of I Promessi Sposi of Manzoni. Defoe's narrator is thankful to God, our preserver, for putting a stop to the dreadful calamity. He's convinced that nothing but the immediate finger of God, nothing but omnipotent power could have done it. But even from his position, poles apart from the Defoe narrator's piety, Camus makes the same observation, that the plague departed as unaccountably as it had arrived. The human measures that had previously been impotent to prevent its fatal spread suddenly became effective as the plague relented in its momentum. In the end, in every historical instance described in our literary specimens, plague simply peters out, slacking of its own accord. It is not mastered. This makes plague a divine or irrational mystery rather than a human responsibility. And a lot of people have problems with that, and I'm sure some, and maybe all of us do. Roland Barthes sharply critiqued Camus for dehistoricizing, even dehumanizing the plague under the figure of a goddess acting like an ancient fate who is unknowable. And Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, they followed suit with indignation. The overarching issue raised for human communities and commonwealths by plague, according to these narratives across the centuries, is that of whether plague is to be attributed to inscrutable causes in heaven, or whether human beings should be held responsible for finding out its causes and taking the appropriate preventative and curative and perhaps punitive measures. However, this simple opposition between an obscurantist religious and a scientifically enlightened approach breaks down with a thoroughgoing examination and reflection on the literature. Somehow, rational response needs to be articulated alongside and coordinated with acknowledgement of its limits. What plague or pandemic, together with the human reaction to it, discloses is a dimension in which our existence is grounded above and beyond itself and beyond our own control. We are made to face our radical non-sovereignty over ourselves and our lives, and our vulnerability to disease and ultimately death. Admission of this condition of our existence is perennially difficult for us to accept and deal with. This contingent predicament of our life never fails to perplex us. We can deny it or we can fanatically fixate on it. In either case, we make it worse, like K in Kafka's novels, compounding its complexity and our own perplexity, and we are often spurred to act in drastic and even desperate ways, upsetting nature's equilibrium and our own. By my emphasis on non-sovereignty, I do not mean to suggest that we cannot and should not be sovereign over certain spheres and aspects of our existence. But the whole of our existence and its ultimate end exceeds our control. We are obliged to open up to something or someone other if we want to relate as whole beings to the real as a whole. This is the existential posture that modern techno-scientific culture is generally geared to refusing and denying. COVID-19, like plagues throughout history, functions as a reminder of this condition, this conditionedness from which we otherwise strive in every way to escape. Manzoni in the Romantic Age, who experienced the limits of Enlightenment rationalism, he turns then into that romantic, and that involves also relinking with the Christian Middle Ages, while Camus, as a 20th century existentialist, was in revolt against the limits of 19th century scientific positivism and its totalizing rationality. Both authors castigate the lack of prompt and adequate reaction to the initial indicators of plague, exposing typical human hypocrisies and tergiversations. Yet both are far from affirming that resolute rational action is all that is called for to get things under control and save the day. A practical fix or technical remedy for the crises is not their focus. Instead, they open a visionary, apocalyptic purview in which the unsurpassable limits of humanity and its mortality are soberingly contemplated. Although in many pandemic narratives, the supernatural explanations are subjected to scathing critique, as well as to ironic ridicule, nevertheless, the narratives in every instance cannot help but acknowledge and expose something far beyond human control as emerging in and through the catastrophe of the Black Death or other pandemics. We're rudely reminded that in any case, death and vulnerability to disease designate a limit to our control. Now, while this avowal of impotence may seem to be a note of hopelessness, and it is such for our ability to control and dominate pandemics by technological means, I suggest that this limit of our human powers is precisely where we should search for motives for sustainable hope in a negative theological register. There's a more authentic dimension of our being human than that of managing inner-worldly threats and crises, and precisely making this quantum leap into a higher dimension of what we might call transhumanity, or existing in relation to others, and the other is at stake in our confrontation with pandemics as mediated by visionary literary texts. Now, Dante's Trasumanar this is the sense of transhumanity that I want to insist on. Transhumanar significar per verba non si poria. You cannot signify by, verbally, what transhumanizing it, that is being transformed in this process of divinization. We're in the Paradiso, that's from the first canto of Dante's Paradiso. It's a transformative relation to a divine other. And this is really then the opposite of the current transhumanist agenda of rendering humanity absolutely autonomous and immune even to death. This latter type of transhumanism, the common one today, aims to overcome our dependence on anything other than ourselves and our own power and technology, and to render the human being invulnerable. This constitutes an idolatry of our particular material organism, perpetuating mere life of individual bodies separated from the continuum of life as a whole. Life is sacred, all right, but if we focus on my individual life, I cannot, that's idolatrous. Life has to be open to the life that we share with one another, that's beyond any one of us. Then life is really sacred. And I think we get a distorted and even perverted view when it's tempting. Right? Every life is worth preserving, of course, but not every physical organism. I mean, we're carriers of this life that goes beyond us. I think this is the kind of open vision towards otherness and towards the otherness that is really inherent in any one of us, in any being whatsoever, that we want to read out of our visionary texts. Because the alternative reasoning is divisive rather than holistic, and it's what leads them to isolating scapegoats as culprits in Manzoni, the coloni infame, right? And it's all false accusations, so they're tortured and executed. And this is all too recurrent throughout our history as well. Now, fiction, self-critically aware of itself as fiction, I think can make room for a truth or a reality that exceeds all possibilities that can be imagined and expressed. It figures relationships without end in a dimension of infinite openness to one another in emotion, which knows no limits. For example, the emotion for the dying mother in William Maxwell's They Came Like Swallows, right? This is part of the literature that came out of the Spanish flu epidemic, 1918 and 19. The other novels, Catherine Ann Porter's Pale Horse, Pale Rider. You hear the quotation from the book of Revelation. But this, they came like swallows. Again, it's a visitation from heaven, and went like swallows. He's quoting a line from a poem by Yeats. Since God per se is unknowable, theology is a sublime and eminently revealing fictio, revealing the Alpha and the Omega. Genuine theology is always negative theology, because it must acknowledge the inadequacy of human discourse to transcendent divinity. Theologies of hope, Jürgen Moltmann's theology of hope, centering on the crucified God's solidarity with suffering humans, or critical philosophies of hope, like Ernst Bloch's Das Prinzip Hoffnung, like the principle of hope, profoundly interpreted are negative theologies. Bloch, in that book, became really a foundation stone of the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, which then leads to Adorno's negative dialectics and to Walter Benjamin's messianic Marxism, which are both forms of negative theology as well. That doesn't mean that they're negative in tenor. In fact, Bloch was trying to reverse Heidegger's pessimism, the Sein zum Tod, right, the being to death. He takes Heidegger, hope is the principle of hope. It's not an object. It's a principle projected towards possible worlds. That's very Heideggerian, but he wanted to give all of that a different spin, not Oswald Spengler, the decline of the West, which influenced Heidegger, but take it in the direction of hope. And if we think of it's a hope that by critically sweeping away idols, which attach absolute value to partial relative instances, it leads to and frees us for action oriented to the all and whole without invidious exclusions. This is clear. This negative theology is it unfixes us from specific objectifications, and there's this openness then towards that transcendence which no one can comprehend. It's infinite, and no finite discourse or even thought can encompass it. This is that motion of opening that we find, I think, in Moltmann's theology of hope, stimulated then the black theology of James Cone, and the ecofeminist theology of Rosemary Ruther, and of course the Latin American liberationist theology of Gustavo Gutierrez. In a negative theological mode, then, it is by relinquishing our own determinate hopes, delimited by our own conscious expectations, that we can enable the salvific event to occur and bring us into its compass. This is an age-old type of wisdom, powerfully expressed also in Asian religions, such as Buddhism and Taoism, their philosophies of not desiring and of actively doing nothing, Wu Wei, embody a wisdom that has come back into vogue from beyond and behind the overweening desire of the modern homo faber to master everything by his own craft and technique, culminating in modern technology. Now, I think we started a little bit after the half. Can I have 10 more minutes?
5 more.
Yeah.
Okay. Just because we were planning on doing Q&A as well before the break.
Okay. Well, we cannot hope to render ourselves invulnerable and overcome every obstacle to human will to exist without the threat of death. That liberal model of progressive society hope, I think we need an other hope, a form of hope that is not about optimistic expectations, but rather about adhering to the real and simply letting it be in its contradictory potential through resisting the impulses to limit it with our own schemas. Pre-axial age religions and archaic culture, they avoid the oppositional logic that has really been a part of all of our cultures since that axial age turning in 500 BC. Opening to the web of relations, I wanted really to talk about the precious scroll of the rat epidemic, to other hope by bringing in some extra-European perspectives, postmodern and indigenous as well. There's this precious scroll of the rat epidemic. You have the Bodhisattva Guanyin summons Huang Jiren, a man, to her celestial palace and offers to intercede with the Jade Emperor with instructions on moral regeneration in order to overcome the plague, but also with practical measures about cats, right? There's already a scientific understanding here that rats are actually the agent spreading the contagion. But it's really combining these two perspectives, which are inconsistent rationally. But the scientific and religious understandings are working side by side in that late Qing dynasty text. And this rational inconsistency, I think, is paralleled by Anishinaabe writer Gerald Vizenor in his notion of survivance as survival plus resistance, but non-oppositional and ironic resistance. He defines it, his character, Ronin Brown, defines survivance as a vision and vital condition to endure, to outwit evil and dominance, and to deny victimry. Through this character as ironic healer, Vizenor attempts to evade closure and victimry. This approach means using indirect means of evasion for coping with superior force that cannot be directly opposed. Now, I guess we're going to have to simply then conclude, what I really wanted to talk about, the Pope's letter, his encyclical, Laudato Si', which sparked off many reactions, and Bruno Latour, his philosophy of Gaia. It's a negative theology of the earth, Gaia, which becomes an absolute, where there is no planet B. We are face to face with an absolute, with the earth. And nevertheless, calling the earth Gaia is according it a kind of transcendence. It's not an object, it's someone that we have to deal with, but Latour is very clear on the ways in which our science is limited and inadequate and cannot master this, this situation. Now, we have to deal with what's at stake is then a relationship to the whole, really, of the earth and its creatures, restoring a sane relationship, and in the sense of healthy sanus. Now, I guess time is up. So, this negative theology of the earth is one that is directed downward towards the earth, intent on landing, atterrir. That's earthing is literally the word that Latour uses. Rather than looking up to heaven for escape, salvation can come only from caring for the earth, which is the source that has created the heaven and the atmosphere that surrounds the earth through the exhalations of living creatures, starting from primeval bacteria. And of course, this is an apocalyptic theology. The last notes were Kierkegaard and Julian of Norwich, right? All shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. She almost died from plague twice, and yet she is articulating this hope in the midst of a kind of helplessness. And Camus then, at the end of his novel, he writes, this was really the last slide, he said, from the moment that the least hope became possible for the population, the effective reign of the plague was terminated. Hope itself in this register is per se the end of the reign of the pandemic. It's the end of panic. In the perspective I've developed here, this is hope not for final solution, but hope as an affirmation of life, despite all its uncontrollable contingency. This is hope not in being able to triumphantly put an end to our vulnerability, but rather hope in spite of our helplessness. Hope is an unconditional openness to life, including an affirmation of its end. Okay, I have to end there. Thank you.
Very much. Any questions? I have a question. So thank you. That was really interesting. Really incredible overview. So much material. My question is, with this idea of a kind of negative theological approach, if we're thinking about pandemics, I guess my question is that approach something that leads to the re-establishing of communities in the way we see, for example, with narrative in the Decameron, or is it something that also contains dangers in and of itself? And here I'm thinking of something like the romantic Giacomo Leopardi ending, that famous poem with Sempre mi fu dolce naufragare in questo mare. So that's sort of my question with it, because I think it's a really interesting way of thinking about plagues and pandemics to open us up to the absolute, but is there not then that danger that we become these atomized individuals focusing only on the absolute and never coming back to our communities?
Well, sure, I think that is a danger, and it is absolutely crucial that negative theology be a basis for enabling community to reestablish. On the basis of what principles? Well, that is really an open question that requires a lot of interaction, discussion among people. But if we can be somewhat detached from our own agendas and be willing then to discuss with others and accepting of other approaches and points of view, I think we're in a better position then to reestablish community. So, negative theology does not prescribe the community. It's the step before, which opens a space where we are receptive to the other, to one another. And I think that is one crucial premise for being able to reestablish communities that are going to be healthy and enable all to thrive without exclusion. So I mean, it is a crucial question. E dolce nel naufragare in questo mare, I take as this is maybe the difference between our predispositions. For me, that is a sublime moment, and not maybe there is an element of danger. Where danger is, there die Rettung auch, right? The salvation. There is the saving as well. That's Hulderling, of course. So sure, there is, but you're right. There's an element of danger because it's throwing open. There's no schema and generally people feel secure if they're within some kind of a framework. So I think that our literature is counseling us to, not to be rigid in our attachment to our frameworks. We can have an idea of Greater Russia or of the American century, or I don't know. Whatever ideas we're attached to are going to run into conflict with others. And the negative theology then is seeing what's idolatrous about our own discourse in its particular expressions. And then that, I think, readies us to be able to hear other discourses and hear them too as being about something that no discourse has any monopoly on. So yeah, without doubt, a crucial question, and it's answered circumstantially over and over again in every circumstance. That question has to always come up.
Any other questions? Well, thank you very much for a fascinating talk.
Okay.